Brian, when you get a minute, I could... Well, this morning was sort of an intro in case people needed to be brought up to speed. We discussed basically the distribution of these psychoactive plants with a history of shamanic use, and then discussed a little bit about the history of them, and I didn't really finish with that because I want to stress that this, I think what we talked about this morning is we got them all to a good place. We got them all to paradise in Africa with clear vision, much food, and plenty of horsing around. And then we broke for lunch. The forces that created that partnership society in prehistory, the forces that allowed the emergence of a non-male dominant social style, were the same forces which then eventually destroyed it as well, because it was nothing more than climatological change is what was happening. As the African continent became drier, the grasslands retreated, the water holes became less frequent and further apart, and the mushroom came under pressure because of increased dryness. And at that point, I think probably the mushroom festivals became less and less frequent. The whole thing became more tenuous, and there was great pressure then to try and figure out how to preserve the mushrooms through the dry times of the year to have them available for ceremonies. And I think that it's the use of honey as a preservative that really set the stage for things to go wrong, because honey turns into a psychedelic compound on its own if you do nothing to it but leave it alone. It ferments, it becomes mead, and mead is a primitive kind of alcoholic beverage. So over several millennia, what began as an ecstatic mushroom cult turned into a beer cult, a cult of alcoholic intoxication. And then you get the same shift of ratios that you see in our own society. I mean, how many women in our own society have their first sexual experiences in an atmosphere of alcohol abuse and misuse? The two almost go together. And less in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, it's almost possible to imagine nobody got laid for 1,000 years in the West without being pretty juiced up, because it was pretty unappetizing, I imagine. So this is a way in which sensory modalities and emphasis on different aspects of psyche change over time without a culture even being aware of it. And then I talked this morning a little bit about the fall into history, the neurotic dysfunctionalism that characterizes historical existence. And I think it's worth going back to that, because some people have the idea that psychedelics are a kind of instant psychotherapy and that they address the concerns of the individual, but they're not concerned to link it up to history, to see what it was for us in the past and what its absence has done for us. I think that the whole phenomenon that we call the fall into history is the scenario of abandonment that we underwent as we broke the umbilical connection to the Gaian matrix of organic life. That's what we were embedded in this African context. But when Africa dried up and we moved out of Africa and into the Middle East, we then were transformed from nomadic pastoralists into primitive agriculturalists and then later city builders, and the entire pattern of male dominance and anxiety is set in place. If you look at the world of 7000 BC, the most sophisticated human structure on the earth of, let's say, 7500 BC is at Jericho in what is now Palestine. And what is it? It's a grain storage tower built at Jericho 72-75 BC. It indicates that the primitive pastoral nomadic form has given way now to an agricultural form that allows for the accumulation of surplus, and hence the need to defend same, and hence the establishment of have and have not psychology, and so forth and so on. So all of the institutions that we now must attempt to reform and grapple with began then. Urbanization, kingship, male dominance, representative politics, all of these things begin then and are further exacerbated a couple or 3,000 years later by the Western decision to go with a phonetic alphabet as a method of communication. See, a phonetic alphabet further removes you away from anything concrete or real or related to nature. There's no ideogram, there's no glyph, there isn't even a rebus. There is simply an abstract symbol which stands for a sound. I mean, this is about as far away from the hands-on approach of language that you could get. Well, the culture that made these decisions, which is our culture, the culture of Europe and the ancient Middle East, has evolved into the dominant culture on the planet and has put in place institutions like science and so forth and so on. Our metaphors have grown ever more cogent in their ability to manipulate matter and energy as they have evolved less and less relevance to ourselves. So now we have ideological systems of tremendous power that none of us can understand or relate to, which is a kind of an odd relationship to knowledge, since knowledge is supposed to be an experience of empowerment, not an experience of disempowerment. But our society has done it differently, and so we all wander around with a sense of disempowerment because we're surrounded by accomplishments that we couldn't possibly duplicate. Well, I mention all this because I think that it shows where the solution lies. If we were in balance 15,000 years ago, and it was achieved through the use of psychedelics, de-emphasis of the ego, non-existence of the nuclear family, and the suppression of the concept of ownership, we should look at these as possible styles of existence that might be put in place in the future. That's this psychedelic society that you've heard me talk about at various times. Well, that's probably enough on that. Oh, you thought so too. When I said we'd look at the geographical distribution, the history, and then the phenomenology, I thought that we would put most of the phenomenology of the thing in here, in this section, because it's important to establish just what we're talking about, and also to empower people to describe their own experiences, which are often so peculiar that unless there is a group such as this, a person tends to just define themselves as starkers I mean, what else can you say about some of this? But, if you're Starkers and you get 10 people to agree with you, you're not Starkers anymore, you're a movement. So I mentioned this morning about DMT, and I made of it the kind of paradigmatic compound because it's so brief, so natural, so powerful, so quick to recover from. And it's also a very good paradigmatic case when talking about what the psychedelic experience is like to have, because I think if you have the DMT experience on the way to the center of that flash, you'll probably have all the other ones. It seems to lie at the center of the mandala. The most startling thing about the DMT flash, and I mentioned this morning when we were talking about Jung, is how astonishing it is. That death by astonishment seems the major danger. And this is even if you're an art historian, a Jungian, an aficionado of symbols, and so forth and so on. It seems to come from some dimension orthogonal to the human world. And it is not a unitary experience, the way the famous white light and all these other wordless, indescribable, elusive, mercurial things are. It isn't like that at all. It's extremely multiplistic, and it's extremely specific in its presentation. And when you smoke DMT, you have the feeling that you have burst into a place, that you have not had a psychological experience, you are not having a mental experience, you have burst into some kind of a space. And within that space, the first shock is that it's inhabited. And this is the shock I've never recovered from, because it was just the last thing I expected to find inside a chemical compound was the equivalent of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. It is inhabited by entities, is the only word to describe them. And they are, as I've said many times, they are like jeweled, self-dribbling basketballs. And there are many of them. And they come out of the background and they present themselves to you. They're literally vibrating up and down with excitement. They're faceted and rotating. And they see you as clearly as you see them. They even greet you. Some of you may recall the old Pink Floyd song, "The Gnomes Have Learned a New Way to Say Hooray." I think it's on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It's the first album. Those Floyd fans who were looking puzzled, it's because it was 40 years ago or something. Anyway, as you burst into this space, the gnomes say hooray, and they present themselves, and they are truly the gnomes of Central European fairy tales, archetypal gnomes. They sing, and out of their singing elfin chatter condense objects which look like nothing at all in this world. I mean, the closest I've been able to come to them are the eggs of Fabergé, these constructs in sapphire and ivory and crystal and vitreous glass that the French designer Fabergé created. Well, these things are like that, but they're like that raised to some excruciating pinnacle of completion, because as they show you these objects, you know beyond any possibility of contravention that if a single one of these objects were to exist in this world, it would change this world forever. If a single one of these objects were to exist in this world, we would spend 1,000 years studying this object. The last time this happened was a guy gave a speech up on a hill about moral obligation. We studied it for 1,000 years. This is the same kind of thing. And these Fabergé hyperdimensional objects are themselves undergoing a dynamic transformation. They're not static objects like the Fabergé eggs. They are undergoing changes, singing, condensing other objects. These objects are crawling all over the ground in front of you, clamoring for your attention. Now remember, 12 seconds before you were sitting in a suburban living room somewhere grappling with some drug somebody wanted you to take. Now all that's gone, and here are these things. I call them tykes because I wanted to capture the sense of their childlikeness. I don't know why I called them tykes, actually. It just seemed like the appropriate thing. If some of you are classicists or students of the literature of the pre-Socratic philosophers, you might recall the 52nd fragment of Heraclitus, which says, the aeon is a child at play with colored balls. The aeon is a child at play with colored balls. And when you break your way into the presence of the aeon, it's extremely it's upsetting. You can't believe it's happening. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance. You could believe this if it just weren't happening to you. And there is this tremendous affection and interest in humanity, and then there is urgency, a lot of urgency. The tykes want to initiate you. They have a message. And the message is, you can do what we are doing. And what they're doing is using their voices to make physical objects condense out of the air. And they're saying, you can do this. Do it. Do it. Do it! And they're on you. And they jump in and out of your chest, which is something that is described in the Amazon, too, the hikuli, in the tryptamine snuff cults of the Yanomamo. They jump in and out of your chest, and they are saying, do this thing, do it, suspend your belief, and eventually you do it. You discover that you can drop the filter of meaning, that your voice can move back several registers, and out comes elf chatter. And this elf chatter is able to wring the air in front of you like a washcloth and get alchemical gold to drip out of the air and to begin to condense in front of you. Well, by this time, most people would like to call time out so they can make phone calls to various philosophers. But there's no time out. It just keeps going. And these things have the aura of strangeness, of alienness is palpable. There's an emotion in there that we just don't have in this world because it's composed of unbelievable alienness in the presence of unbelievable familiarity. It's an ecstasy that is a coincidentia oppositorum. Simultaneously, it is both what it is and what it is not. And the human mind can't handle that. That's called cognitive dissonance. I mean, you just go into a conniption fit of some sort. Well, the very first time I smoked DMT in 1967, with absolutely no expectation, this happened to me. And it has happened every time since. And then I've had occasion to observe people taking DMT in countries where it's legal. And what I see is there is an archetype which surrounds DMT, which you must make your way through it. But at the center of the archetype is not present, and only the alien is present. The archetype is that of the circus or the carnival. The carnival. Think for a moment about the carnival. It has two aspects. One is blazing light and activity. At the center of the triple ring, the lady in the spangled costume is high above the main floor, and the lions and the tigers and the clowns are parading around. That's part of it. But it has another aspect. Just off to the side of the big tent, there are the side shows, the hoochie-coochie dancers, the two-headed man, and so forth and so on. In other words, there's this kinky, peculiar shadow side of it. And I often, if any of you are fans of the film of Federico Fellini, here's a man who understood the archetype of the circus, and how, if you remember in Amarcord, that circus, or if you remember in Giulietta di Spiri, the flaming doorway into the room with the bed springs and the crepe paper flames. These are carnival images that relate back to DMT. When you finally come into the center of it, these are all seen to be veils. It veils itself that way because that's how you, it's the old candy to the baby routine. It treats us as people who would like to go to the circus. And then it takes us to the circus. But then there is a revelation beyond that. And I don't know how many people present in this room have confronted the thing I'm talking about. I always at this moment am aware that some people are saying, my, doesn't he perfectly get it? And other people are saying, huh? What is this? What is this guy talking about? The point I want to make is it's real. It's not vague. You don't have to strain for it. Nobody wonders whether or not it happened to them. It's just like somebody walking up to you and taking you by the arm and saying, there's something I insist on showing you. Come this way, please. And it was the presence of the entities that shattered the person who I was, because I was a scientific rationalist, a reductionist. I had no room for elves in my cosmology. And here they were, hundreds of them. So it seems to me that this is a central question that shamanism has always dealt with, perhaps not with the kind of ontological sophistication that we imagine ourselves to have, but this is the question that must be asked. Who's in there? Who is this?